September 18th, 1966. Kenilworth, Illinois. 21-year-old Valerie Percy, the daughter of state senatorial candidate Charles Percy, is murdered inside her bedroom. She is bludgeoned and stabbed to death by an unknown intruder who breaks into her family's home, and while Valerie's stepmother catches a brief glimpse of the perpetrator, he manages to flee the scene. Over the years, numerous suspects would pop up on the radar, including a gang of burglars and a violent individual whose family lived in the same neighborhood, but no one is ever charged with Valerie's murder. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we will be traveling back over 50 years to chronicle one of the most infamous unsolved crimes of the 1960s, the 1966 murder of Valerie Percy. This case was a pretty big deal at the time it happened, because Valerie was from one of the most prominent families in the Chicago area. At the time the murder took place, her father, Charles Percy, was in the midst of a campaign for Illinois state senator, and there's a good chance this tragic event helped him garner enough sympathy votes to score an upset victory in the election. But in spite of the victim's father becoming one of the most influential people in the state, the crime was never solved. What really shook up the community is that Valerie was brutally murdered in her own bed while the rest of her family was in the house. She lived in a very affluent area which seemed like the last place you'd ever expect to find a violent crime of this magnitude. At first, no one could figure out the motive for this murder, but there have been numerous theories put forward over the years. I've received multiple requests to cover this case, including from a listener named Michelle, and Jim Goodluck of the Forgotten News podcast also recently sent it my way as a suggestion, so I think it's an ideal time to do an episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved murder of Valerie Percy. Our story begins in Illinois in 1966. Our central figure is 21-year-old Valerie Percy, who lives with her wealthy, prominent family in the village of Kenilworth, an affluent community just north of Chicago, which borders the shores of Lake Michigan. Her father is Charles Percy, a millionaire businessman who was president of the Bell & Howell Corporation, a manufacturer of camera equipment, before he decided to move into politics. Charles and his wife, Jean Dickerson Percy, would have 3 children together, including Valerie and her twin sister Sharon. Sadly, Jean died in 1947 due to complications during surgery to repair her damaged colon, but Charles later got remarried to another woman named Lorraine Geyer, and the couple had 2 more children. After making a failed run for governor of Illinois in 1964, Charles eventually decided to run as the Republican candidate in the race for Illinois state senator. By the fall of 1966, he was in the midst of campaigning in a race against his opponent, incumbent Democratic Senator Paul Douglas. After graduating from Cornell University, Valerie became involved in her father's campaign and was in charge of interviewing and recruiting volunteers. On the evening of September 17th, Valerie was at her family's luxurious 3-story, 17-room home in Kenilworth, located on a 3-acre estate next to Lake Michigan. After having dinner with her stepmother, some of her siblings, and 2 campaign staff members, Valerie retired to her second-floor bedroom at around 10 p.m. Later that evening, her twin sister Sharon returned home from a date and went to Valerie's room to return a raincoat she had borrowed. At the time, Valerie was sitting in bed watching television. At around 12:30 a.m. on September 18th, Charles Percy returned home and looked in on Valerie's bedroom to see her sleeping, and unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time she was seen alive. At around 5 a.m. that morning, Lorraine Percy was awakened by the sound of glass breaking and a clicking noise which sounded like footsteps across a tile floor. Lorraine figured that one of her children might have accidentally knocked something over and drifted back asleep, but shortly thereafter, she was awoken again by the sound of someone moaning. The noise was coming from Valerie's bedroom, so Lorraine decided to get up and called out her name. She received no response, but noticed that there was light coming out from under Valerie's bedroom door. When Lorraine opened the door to look inside, she was shocked to see a dark-haired man standing over Valerie's bed with a flashlight. He was described as being around 5'8", 160 pounds, and wearing a checkered shirt, but Lorraine did not actually catch a glimpse of his face. The bed appeared to be soaked in blood, so Lorraine let out an audible gasp, prompting the man to turn and shine his flashlight in her eyes to blind her. Lorraine instantly ran out of the room, woke up her husband, and set off the house's burglar alarm. The intruder immediately ran down the stairs and fled the house before anyone had a chance to intercept him, and he managed to make an escape. When Charles Percy entered his daughter's bedroom, he turned on the light and was shocked to discover that Valerie had been bludgeoned and stabbed numerous times. After notifying the police, Charles phoned a neighbor who happened to be a doctor to come over and check on Valerie, but he determined that she was already dead. The intruder had used an unknown blunt object to bludgeon Valerie across the head 4 times, fracturing her skull, before she was stabbed across her face, chest, and stomach a total of 14 times. Her nightgown was pulled up to her ribs, but she was not sexually assaulted. Valerie's purse and wallet, which contained $60 in cash, were still in her bedroom, and since nothing appeared to be missing from the house, robbery did not seem to be the motive. The brutal nature of the crime made many people believe that the perpetrator had an intense hatred of Valerie, but she did not have any known enemies. She also did not have a boyfriend at the time, or anyone who seemed to have a dangerous obsession with her. Investigators even searched through Valerie's diary, but found nothing in there to shed any light on what happened. When police searched the residence, they discovered that a 4-inch hole had been cut in a screen door before a glass cutter was used to break through a French door, which led to the music room. This was likely the source of the glass-breaking sound Lorraine heard when she was briefly stirred awake at 5 a.m., so it seemed like the intruder had immediately gone upstairs into Valerie's bedroom after breaking inside. Investigators pulled about a dozen different fingerprints from the house, along with 5 bloody palm prints on the banister. Footprints were found on the sandy beach area outside the residence, but since there were no traces of sand inside the house, the killer likely ran this way to escape. A black leather glove was also found near the scene, so if the perpetrator was wearing gloves when he committed the crime, he probably did not leave any fingerprints behind in the house. Divers performed a search of Lake Michigan for possible evidence, and eventually discovered an army bayonet. While it could not be conclusively determined that it was the murder weapon, the bayonet's handle did match Valerie's head wounds, so this may have been the object used to bludgeon her. The case generated massive publicity, and the Percy family offered a $50,000 reward for information. Needless to say, it shook up the community in a big way, as this was the first homicide to ever take place in Chicago's affluent North Shore suburbs. The murder became such a major story that Richard Nixon himself personally attended Valerie's funeral. In order to give the family time to grieve this horrific tragedy, Charles Percy and his opponent, Senator Paul Douglas, both agreed to suspend their campaigns. 2 weeks later, Percy announced that after discussing things with his family, he was going to resume his run for state senator. When the election finally took place that November, Percy wound up defeating Douglas with 56% of the vote. The result was considered an upset, though some believed that public sympathy over his daughter's murder may have helped tip the scales in Percy's favor. He soon decided to sell their family's home, feeling that they could no longer stay there after what happened. Investigators looked into the possibility that Valerie's murder might be connected to 2 other similar crimes which took place that year. On June 30th, another home invasion had taken place in Evanston, another suburb on the North Shore which is located just 3 miles away from Kenilworth. That night, an unidentified male intruder broke into the home of 19-year-old Sharon Bubes by climbing up a ladder and entering through her bedroom window. Sharon soon woke up and saw this man standing over her with a ball-peen hammer in one hand and some of her undergarments in the other. The intruder told Sharon not to panic, but when she started screaming, he struck her on the head with the ball-peen hammer. Sharon let out a scream, prompting her mother to come running into the bedroom. She caught a brief glimpse of the attacker before he climbed out the window and fled, so Sharon wound up surviving the attack. The attacker was described as being around 17 to 19 years old, 5'10", having dark hair and glasses, and wearing a green plaid shirt. A composite sketch of the suspect was circulated, but he was never caught. Only 1 week after Valerie was killed, another brutal home invasion murder took place in Cincinnati. On September 25th, 28-year-old Jerry Bricka, his 23-year-old wife Linda, and their 4-year-old daughter Debbie were all stabbed to death inside their beds. Jerry and Linda were both tied up, and even though some money was missing from Jerry's wallet, robbery did not appear to be the motive. Even though Cincinnati was located several miles away from Kenilworth, Linda did hail from a wealthy Chicago family. Linda and Valerie did run in the same social circles, and it is possible they might have known each other before Linda moved away. In spite of some similarities, law enforcement never found any tangible connection between the two crimes, though the Bricka family murders also remain unsolved to this day. Over the next few years, police would interview thousands of potential suspects, but never found anyone who seemed like a strong candidate to be the killer. However, a promising lead did emerge in 1969 when a fugitive named Harold James Evans, who had recently been added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, was arrested in Chicago on charges of rape and robbery. Less than 2 years earlier, Evans and another man named Frederick Malchow had been convicted of these charges in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, but managed to pull off an escape together while they were being led from the courthouse to the county jail. 2 days later, Malchow's body was discovered in the Schuylkill River after he had fallen to his death from a railroad trestle. Upon his recapture, Evans told police that while they were sharing a cell in Montgomery County, Malchow had confessed to him that he was responsible for the murder of Valerie Percy. Malchow was a career thief who had a habit of flying to different cities to commit burglaries there before he flew back home. Malchow allegedly told Evans that he had flown from Texas to Illinois in September of 1966 for the purpose of burglarizing the Percy residence. According to Malchow, he broke into the house and entered Valerie's bedroom, but when she woke up and caught him in the act, he wound up killing her. Of course, given that Malchow was now deceased, and Evans himself was a career criminal, police did not give much credence to Evans's story and pretty much ignored it. However, in 1973, the Chicago Sun-Times published a series of articles from investigative reporters Art Patak and Hugh Huff, which connected Valerie Percy's murder to a gang of burglars, and these articles wound up earning the two reporters a Pulitzer Prize. This gang of burglars consisted of Frederick Malchow and Harold James Evans, along with 2 other thieves named Frank Hoheimer and William Jackson. They were apparently connected with the mob and spent the mid-1960s going on cross-country sprees which involved burglarizing homes in a lot of different cities, including the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. One of the primary sources was a mobster named Leo Rugendorf, who told the Sun-Times that Hoheimer had confessed to him that while attempting to burglarize the Percy residence, he killed Valerie because she woke up while he was inside her bedroom. Rugendorf also claimed that Hoheimer had been casing the Percy residence prior to the murder and had called him from there while he was working at his food products company. Phone records did show that a call had been made from the Percy residence to Rugendorf's company during this time period. Rugendorf was terminally ill at the time he shared this information and died before the articles were published. Another source for these articles was Frank Hoheimer's brother, Wayne, who claimed that the day after the Percy murder, Frank shared a story with him about killing a girl because she had made a lot of noise and put up a fight during a robbery attempt. When Wayne asked which girl it was, Frank replied, "It's all in the newspapers and on the radio today." At the time the Sun-Times articles were published, Hoheimer was serving a 30-year sentence at the Iowa State Penitentiary for a series of burglaries. Like Harold James Evans, Hoheimer had also spent a couple of months on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list before he was captured. Believe it or not, when questioned, Hoheimer fingered Frederick Malchow as being Valerie Percy's killer. On the day of the murder, Hoheimer claimed that his fellow gang members had visited his apartment in Chicago for a change of clothes, and that Malchow provided him with some bloody clothing which he asked him to burn in an incinerator. Malchow then later confessed to Hoheimer that he was responsible for what happened to Valerie. However, Hoheimer's ex-wife, who was living with him at that time, said she did not recall any incident involving bloody clothing, and did not believe Hoheimer was even at their apartment on the day the murder took place. In the end, there was no evidence to actually place any of these suspects at the murder scene, as the 5 bloody palm prints found on the banister at the Percy residence did not match Malchow or Hoheimer. The only piece of evidence which seemed to point to anyone was an airplane baggage ticket which placed Malchow in Chicago, but that was hardly conclusive. In spite of the newfound publicity the Sun-Times articles generated for the case, the investigation hit a brick wall again. It's worth mentioning that Frank Hoheimer would end up publishing a memoir titled The Home Invaders, Confessions of a Cat Burglar, which was later adapted by director Michael Mann into his 1981 thriller Thief, starring James Caan. Anyway, life did still go on for the Percy family. Months after the murder, Valerie's twin sister Sharon wound up marrying Jay Rockefeller of the famous Rockefeller family and became First Lady of Virginia when her husband was elected as state governor. He was eventually elected to the United States Senate, while Sharon became president and CEO of WETA-TV. Sharon is still alive today at age 73 and has been married to her husband for over 50 years. Charles Percy served 3 terms as senator and died in 2011 at the age of 91 without ever learning who murdered his daughter. Things took an interesting turn in 2013 when author Glenn Wall published a new book about the case titled Sympathy Vote. For the first time, it put the spotlight on another potential suspect named William Thoresen III. Thoresen was the son of a wealthy steel tycoon, and his family happened to live in Kenilworth, only a block and a half from the Percy residence. While Thoresen lived in San Francisco in 1966, he was known for often returning to Kenilworth to visit his family. Well, in spite of hailing from a respected family, Thoresen was known for being a spoiled, angry individual with a history of erratic behavior and troubles with the law. He often lashed out at people and was described in one FBI report as violent, a mental case, and armed and dangerous. At one point, he was arrested for allegedly setting off some dynamite outside a radio station in Tucson, Arizona, but the charges were dropped when a witness refused to testify. Believe it or not, in 1965, William and his brother Richard had charges filed against them by their own father after his home in Kenilworth was burglarized. The day before Richard was set to go to trial, he was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in an apparent suicide. There was some suspicion about the fact that Richard was shot behind the right ear, even though he was left-handed, but regardless, William wound up collecting a substantial inheritance from his brother. During the investigation into Valerie Percy's murder, Thoresen's probation officer in Los Angeles brought him to the attention of the Chicago police, naming him as a potential suspect. The authorities did attempt to question Thoresen about the murder, but he was very uncooperative and refused to be interviewed. On June 10, 1970, Thoresen was shot to death by his wife Louise. When she went on trial 5 months later, Louise was found not guilty on the grounds of self-defense, painting her husband as a violent man who had allegedly admitted to killing several people, including his brother Richard. Though the story was never corroborated, Louise claimed that William had hired a gunman to murder Richard, and then covered his tracks by murdering the gunman after the guy demanded more money. The whole saga of William and Louise Thoresen's marriage is a pretty bizarre story in its own right, and a few years after her acquittal, Louise published a book about her experiences. The one piece of evidence which convinced Glenn Wall that Thoresen might have been Valerie's killer was the bayonet found in Lake Michigan after the murder. Less than 3 months later, Louise Thoresen was arrested at JFK Airport while shipping military weapons for her husband, and 3 bayonets were found in the shipment. 3 months after that, Thoresen was charged with possession of illegal weaponry once it was discovered that he had been hoarding and stockpiling tons of military weapons at various locations around the country, some of which were bayonets. In 2016, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the crime, Kenilworth officials publicly announced that they were still investigating the case. That same year, in response to having his Freedom of Information Act request denied, a New York attorney named John Kelly had filed a lawsuit demanding that the 20,000 pages of police records from the case file be released publicly. However, a judge ruled that the records should remain under wraps because it was still an active, ongoing investigation, and publicly releasing them could jeopardize things. So 5 decades later, there are still no answers about who murdered Valerie Percy. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So this was quite a sensational murder case when it took place back in 1966, and all things considered, it's surprising that it isn't more well known today. I mean, it does frequently get mentioned in the Chicago media, but you don't often hear about it outside Illinois. But it's easy to see why this case was so shocking at the time it occurred. We have the daughter of one of the state's wealthiest, most prominent politicians, who was murdered inside her home while her family was there, and her stepmother catches a glimpse of the perpetrator while he's committing the crime. Under those circumstances, it just seems unthinkable that the killer could remain unidentified and manage to get away with it for over 50 years. Kenilworth was just not a community where horrible crimes like this took place, and this crime just seemed to drive home the message that no one was safe and that anyone could get away with murder with the right amount of luck. I can't imagine how things would play out if a family member of a political candidate in the middle of a campaign race was murdered under these circumstances today. In this age of social media and the 24-hour news cycle, I can imagine this thing turning into a story where the political elements totally overshadowed the murder. Remember, Charles Percy's victory over Senator Paul Douglas in the election less than 2 months later was considered an upset, and I can only imagine how much today's media would focus on whether Percy only won the race because the voters felt sympathy over him losing his daughter. And I imagine there would be conspiracy theories as well, considering that Valerie was working on her father's campaign at the time. But surprisingly, while researching this case, I found a refreshing lack of conspiracy theories. It doesn't sound like anyone seriously considered the possibility that Valerie's murder was connected to the campaign race. No one believes that Senator Douglas had Valerie killed, or that the Percy family orchestrated her death in order to gain the sympathy vote. Even though Charles Percy was a powerful man, who would actually be looked at as a potential candidate for President of the United States a few years later, it really seems like Valerie's murder had nothing to do with her father. We've had a number of people named as potential suspects who had a number of different motives, but first, let's examine the crime itself. Well, one of the most prominent theories is that Valerie was killed simply because she happened to wake up while an intruder was in the house, but the fact that she was bludgeoned and stabbed so many times makes some people think the murder was a lot more personal and that she was specifically targeted. Now, everyone who knew Valerie stated that she did not have an enemy in the world. She did not have a boyfriend, as it seems like she was devoting herself to working on her father's campaign, but it sounds like they never uncovered any obvious suspects who would have had a potential motive to kill her because she had rejected his romantic advances or something. While Valerie was not sexually assaulted, her nightgown was pulled up to her rib area, so this might indicate that someone could have entered her bedroom with the intention of raping her, but when she woke up and attempted to fight him off, he killed her. Now, one angle of this crime which I'm not sure has ever been explored is the possibility that this was a mistaken identity killing. Remember, Valerie had a twin sister, Sharon, so could it be possible that someone who wanted to kill Sharon could have murdered the wrong twin by mistake? While Valerie was single, Sharon had a pretty high-profile boyfriend, Jay Rockefeller, who hailed from one of the most famous families in America and had already been elected to the West Virginia House of Delegates by this point. On the night of the murder, Sharon was actually out on a date, and when she returned to the residence, she went up to Valerie's bedroom in order to return a raincoat she borrowed. Let's just say the killer was targeting Valerie and followed her home. If he was watching the house and happened to see Sharon entering Valerie's bedroom through the window, could he have mistakenly assumed it was Sharon's room? And then when he broke inside and attacked Valerie in her bed, he believed he was attacking Sharon. Yeah, I know, this is all just wild speculation on my part, and probably a major stretch. Sharon returned home around midnight, and the killer didn't enter the house until 5 a.m., so if he was watching Sharon through the window, I doubt he would wait outside for 5 hours. As far as I know, the investigation never uncovered anyone with a big enough grudge against Sharon to murder her, so the mistaken identity angle probably has no relevance, but it's intriguing to think about, considering how rare it is for someone to be murdered inside the same home as their twin sibling. Now, before we talk about specific suspects, we should address the other two similar crimes which took place that year. First off, there's the attack on Sharon Bubes, which took place in Evanston just 2.5 months earlier. Evanston is only 3 miles away from Kenilworth, and while Sharon survived her attack, there are enough compelling similarities between the two cases to suggest the same perpetrator might be responsible. Both crimes involve someone sneaking into a young woman's bedroom and attacking the victim in bed after she woke up. We don't exactly know what object was used to bludgeon Valerie on her head, but the man who attacked Sharon used a ball-peen hammer. Lorraine Percy only saw a silhouette of Valerie's attacker in the dark and didn't get a good enough look at his face for a composite sketch, but she described him as being around 5'10" and wearing a checkered shirt. Sharon's attacker was described as 5'8", around 17 to 19 years old, and wearing a green plaid shirt. I don't think the height difference is strong enough to rule out the possibility of both these attackers being the same man. Sharon's attacker wore glasses, but I'm not sure if Lorraine's glimpse of Valerie's attacker would have been clear enough to make out if he was wearing glasses. Regardless, they never found the person who attacked Sharon, but I can't rule out the possibility that he was responsible for what happened to Valerie. Now, the Bricca family murders, they took place in Cincinnati, which is 5 hours away from Kenilworth, so it's a bigger stretch to think it might be connected to Valerie's murder. But I can't overlook the fact that 2 brutal home invasion murders where young women were stabbed to death in their bedroom happened to take place within 1 week of each other. While there was money missing from Jerry Bricca's wallet, nothing else appeared to be stolen from the house, and since someone went to the trouble of tying up Jerry and Linda and brutally stabbing them and their 4-year-old daughter, the motive for this crime seemed a lot more personal than robbery. Now, this case could probably be the subject of its own podcast episode, and I know that True Crime Garage has done their own episode, but I will mention that the prime suspect in these murders was Fred Leininger, a veterinarian Linda worked for. Rumors circulated that Leininger was having an affair with Linda and murdered her and her family because she wanted to call it off. Leininger refused to cooperate with investigators, and both he and his wife committed suicide together in 2004. I can't say for certain if Leininger murdered the Bricca family, but if he was the perpetrator, I doubt he had any involvement with Valerie Percy's murder, since there's no reason for him to travel all the way to Kenilworth. The fact that Valerie and Linda ran in the same social circles and may have known each other at some point is probably nothing more than a coincidence, so I doubt there's any connection between the two cases. But these murders are still unsolved, so I cannot overlook the possibility that someone could have been traveling through the Midwest during this time period and entering random people's homes to commit murder. It seems there are 3 primary suspects in Valerie's murder: the 2 burglars, Frederick Malchow and Frank Hoheimer, and William Thorson III. The theory about the burglars gained a lot of traction during the 1970s, and some of the original investigators seemed to believe that at least one of those 2 men was responsible, while the theory about Thorson has only popped up in recent years because of the book Sympathy Vote. The Chicago Sun-Times articles which pointed at Malchow and Hoheimer garnered a Pulitzer Prize, and on the surface, the idea of Valerie being murdered because she woke up and interrupted a burglary in progress does seem to make sense. But there are still some major problems with this theory, namely, that the only major evidence is the word of a bunch of career criminals who aren't exactly the most reliable, trustworthy witnesses. Let's break all this down. Frederick Malchow first popped up on the radar when his partner in crime, Harold James Evans, told authorities that Malchow had confessed the murder to him. Of course, Evans said this when he was captured after being on the run as one of the country's 10 most wanted fugitives, and Malchow was already dead by this point, so I can see why you'd want to take his claims with a grain of salt. It sounds like the authorities pretty much felt the same way, and dismissed Evans' story until Malchow's name re-emerged a couple years later. The next guy who named Malchow as the perpetrator was another member of his gang of burglars, Frank Hoheimer. But Hoheimer only said this when other people started pointing the finger at him as Valerie Percy's killer, so you can see how it would be in Hoheimer's best interest to deflect the blame to someone else. Hoheimer's ex-wife failed to corroborate his story about burning some bloody clothing Malchow had given to him, and other than the word of two criminals who seemed to have no qualms about throwing a deceased associate under the bus, there really isn't anything solid to implicate Malchow. All we really have is a baggage claim ticket placing Malchow in Chicago at the time of the murder, but that doesn't actually place him inside the Percy residence. Now, Frank Hoheimer does seem like a stronger suspect, because multiple sources named him in those Chicago Sun-Times articles, but there are still some issues here. The guy who set this whole thing in motion was Leo Rugendorf, a career gangster who decided to implicate Hoheimer. Since Rugendorf was terminally ill at the time, you could assume that he had developed a guilty conscience, but it sounds like some people were pretty cynical about Rugendorf's true intentions. You see, when Hoheimer was originally indicted on the burglary charges he was serving time in prison for, he named Rugendorf as the mastermind behind two of those jobs, one of which involved the theft of $200,000 worth of jewelry. And lo and behold, it wasn't long before Rugendorf came forward and shared information implicating Hoheimer in Valerie Percy's murder. Now, Rugendorf was in such poor health that he died before he could stand trial or serve any prison time for those jobs Hoheimer accused him of masterminding. But really, is it that much of a stretch to think that a terminally ill mobster might decide to deliver one final middle finger to a guy as revenge for ratting him out? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Rugendorf's story about Hoheimer isn't true, but he clearly had an axe to grind, and I would not be surprised if he might have had ulterior motives for falsely implicating Hoheimer in a murder he had nothing to do with. Rugendorf did not have much time left, so it's not like he had a lot to lose if he tried something like this. In his defense, Rugendorf did provide one piece of evidence to support his story when he mentioned a phone call that Hoheimer allegedly made to his company from inside the Percy residence, a claim which was backed up by phone records. But on the other hand, I'm not entirely sure why this phone call would have been made to begin with. If Hoheimer was casing the Percy residence in preparation for a burglary, why would he break inside and make a call from their phone? That seems awfully risky and illogical to me. Now, even though Rugendorf had a grudge against Hoheimer, you might find it pretty damning that Hoheimer's own brother, Wayne, implicated him and claimed he heard him confess to the murder. Well, Wayne Hoheimer wasn't exactly devoid of credibility issues either, as he was known for having a serious gambling problem. Overall, I think my biggest problem is that the cases against Malchow and Hoheimer is that they rely almost entirely on questionable witnesses who supposedly overheard them admit to the crime, but there's no physical evidence linking either of them to the scene. Remember, the bloody palm prints found on the banister did not match Malchow or Hoheimer. The main theory surrounding both these cases is that they murdered Valerie because she woke up and interrupted them while they were attempting to burglarize the house. And while I can't say I'm an expert on how to pull off a burglary, the way this murder was carried out does not seem to fit the criteria of a burglary gone wrong. Nothing was stolen, but I suppose you could explain that by saying Valerie woke up before they had the opportunity to steal anything. The issue is that the perpetrator seemed to go right to Valerie's room immediately after they entered the house. Lorraine Percy was initially awoken by the sounds of glass breaking and footsteps shortly before she heard Valerie moaning in her bedroom, so that suggests that the perpetrator was in the house for a very short time before they attacked Valerie. But if their intention was to burglarize the house, why would they instantly go upstairs to someone's room? Why not start off by searching the ground floor for valuables? And furthermore, if you're going to pull off a burglary inside a large fancy house where multiple people are sleeping, why wait until 5 a.m.? It was a 3-story, 17-room residence, and if someone in that house is an early riser, you're not going to have much time to steal anything before they wake up. I would assume that someone who burglarized houses for a living, like Malchow and Hoheimer did, would plan things out a lot better. No, as far as I'm concerned, the way the series of events unfolded indicates to me that the perpetrator was specifically targeting Valerie and broke into the house for the express purpose of entering her bedroom either to sexually assault or murder her. I could see a random burglar killing Valerie because she woke up and saw him in her room, but I'm not sure they'd go to the trouble of bludgeoning her across the head 4 times and stabbing her 14 times because that just seems like major overkill. If I were a betting man, I'd wager that Valerie's murder was a lot more personal and had nothing to do with a botched burglary. So now we'll move on to our last suspect, William Thoresen III. It doesn't sound like he had much of a relationship with Valerie, but the fact that Thoresen's family lived in such close proximity to the Percy residence and that he had such a history of violent erratic behavior makes him a very compelling candidate to have committed this crime. Even if he didn't really know Valerie personally, Thoresen could have laid eyes on her at a time he was living in or visiting the neighborhood and eventually decided to target her. Everything I've read about Thoresen indicates that he was not a rational thinking man, so this crime might not have required a lot of pre-planning. He could have been in Kenilworth visiting his old residence when he made the spontaneous decision to break into Valerie's bedroom and attack her. In his book, Sympathy Vote, a quote Glenn Wall used to describe the crime was, "Whoever did this came away with nothing." And that's pretty accurate. Thoresen definitely fits the profile of a man who would be brazen enough to stab a woman 14 times in her bedroom while several of her family members were in the house, even though he had nothing to gain by doing so. It's true there really isn't any concrete evidence placing Thoresen in the area that night, but as far as I can tell, he doesn't really have a verifiable alibi either. Given how rich he was, it sounds like Thoresen had the freedom to travel around the country whenever he pleased, and since he would sometimes visit his former neighborhood in Kenilworth, who's to say that he couldn't have been there on the night of the murder? Since he did not live there anymore, Thoresen could have easily skipped town during the aftermath to return home to San Francisco and slipped under the radar during the original investigation. When Thoresen's name was submitted to investigators as a potential suspect by his probation officer, he refused to cooperate with them or answer any questions. It's a shame they did not press Thoresen harder, as it would have been important to establish his whereabouts on the night of the murder. But since police wound up interviewing thousands of potential suspects, I can see how he might have slipped through the cracks. The most compelling piece of evidence which suggests that Thoresen might be the perpetrator is the fact that a bayonet was found in Lake Michigan, and Thoresen and his wife were busted with bayonets in their possession months later. Granted, it was never conclusively determined that this bayonet was used as the murder weapon to stab Valerie, but really, why else would a military bayonet be at the bottom of the lake in such an affluent community? Since there were footprints found on the beach outside the Percy residence, it seems logical that the killer used this opportunity to toss the murder weapon into the lake before they fled the area. The bayonet's handle also seemed to match the wounds in Valerie's head, so I think it's pretty likely that this bayonet was used to bludgeon and stab her. While Thoresen was never charged or officially connected to any murders, a lot of people believe that he was responsible for multiple deaths, including the suspicious suicide of his brother Richard. I guess the big obstacle with pinning Valerie's murder on Thoresen is the same issue with pinning it on Frederick Malchow. Neither of these men was considered a serious suspect until after they were already dead. So that makes it all the more difficult to perform a thorough investigation and determine the likelihood of them being the perpetrator. Forensic science has advanced so much in the past 50 years, but given that Thoresen died in 1970, I'm not sure how much usable evidence there might still be to positively link him to the crime. After all this time, could the bloody palm prints found in the Percy residence or the black leather glove found outside be linked to Thoresen? I'm not sure. I can't say with 100% certainty that Thoresen is the killer, but I find him to be the most believable suspect. It just makes more sense to me that a mentally unstable man with a history of violence would break into a woman's bedroom and murder her for no apparent reason, rather than a professional burglar stabbing her 14 times without even stealing anything from the house. Valerie comes across as the victim of a lot of anger and rage, rather than someone who simply woke up at the wrong time and interrupted a burglary. Given the amount of time which has passed, and the fact that the main suspects are currently deceased, it will probably be difficult to solve this case, but it is good to know that people are still working hard to keep it in the spotlight. In addition to the book Sympathy Vote recently putting the spotlight on Thoresen as a suspect, we've also had that attorney, John Kelly, making Freedom of Information Act requests and going to court in an attempt to get the case files released to the public. The police claim that it is still an active, ongoing investigation, so you never know what might happen. So if you have any information on the unsolved murder of Valerie Percy, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. We also have a new donor this week named Dylan, so thank you very much, Dylan. And since we've entered a new month, now would be a good time to thank our recurring monthly donors. And they are Aura, Lewis, Kathleen, Brian, Laura, Victoria, Heather, Eleanor, Purity, Keisha, Stacy, Dawn, Frederick, Clinton, Claire, Laura Lee, Elliot, and Carol. So thank you very much, everyone. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. Need to provide my thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who is responsible for our eerie music score. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself and your fellow listeners, feel free to join and I'll approve your entry into the group. And believe it or not, we are officially now only 1 month away from CrimeCon, where I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row. It's taking place at the Gaylord Opryland Hotel in Nashville from May 4th to the 6th, and I'm really looking forward to meeting my listeners. So if you're planning to attend CrimeCon and have yet to purchase tickets to the event, you can receive a 10% discount by using our podcast promo code. Just visit crimecon.com and get 10% off by entering the promo code TTWC. That's TTWC. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.